So guys, in this video, I just want to talk about my experience cold approaching. So I started cold approach a year ago. The specific day was September the 14th, 2024. And if you can't tell, I'm from London, or a small town outside of London. And I did my first approach in September 14th, 2024. And yeah, it's been a year since then, obviously a year and some change. And yeah, of course, so much has happened since I started the journey that time ago. So I thought I'd give a breakdown of, essentially what the journey's been like, all the ups and downs. And yeah, hopefully anybody watching can relate to, to what I've experienced. Maybe some of you haven't actually approached yet. Maybe some of you have approached by yourselves and you haven't really found any success, or maybe you found a little bit of success, but you seem to have plateaued or hit some sort of wall. And yeah, hopefully my story so far will be somewhat helpful to your journey. And I think that, the main reason I wanted to make this video and particularly start this channel is because, you can see me, I'm nothing special. I'm sure a lot of people will think this guy is pretty average looking. He doesn't seem to be that looks maxed, money maxed. I'm a pretty normal guy. I wouldn't say I'm extraordinary by any stretch of the imagination when it comes to finances or social skills or looks, I'm a fairly skinny guy. About 5'11", so I guess I've got some height going for me, but yeah, fairly skinny, pretty tall, but nothing special, right? And I know a lot of guys watching are probably guys who, like me, used to watch red pill content and probably thought that dating for them was essentially never going to work. So yeah, hopefully my journey with cold approach will in some way inspire you to either get started or to continue or to just follow along and see what you can gain from my experience. So I've been waffling for long enough. So I think like I said, I started September 14th, 2024, and it was a sunny day just like this, and I decided to go into central London and do my first approach. Now I should say, a week before that, I actually tried to do this already, and I failed miserably. I went to central London the week before, and I went to this place called South Bank, which is essentially by the River Thames. And I kid you not, I walked around for about 2 hours and did not approach a single person. Did not approach anybody because I was very scared, and even though I was very motivated to try approach, having watched cold approach content before, when it actually came to being in the city and being outside and trying to approach, it was so difficult, and I was too much in my head. I was way too anxious, and yeah, I froze and I bailed on every single approach and did not do a single approach. And so yeah, I remember coming back from that outing and sitting on the train dissatisfied, angry with myself, thinking, I'm such a pussy, or like, why couldn't I do it? And it was very frustrating. And then I said to myself, you know what, at least you came out, at least you tried, even though you didn't get any reps on the board, at least you actually came outside and tried. So yeah, that was the week before. And then a week later, I regathered myself and I said, you know what, let's try again and let's see what happens. And so I remember I got on the train, and then I was sat on the train, and I'd heard that a good way to make it easier to approach is to warm yourself up socially, which could be something as simple as talking to the train staff, or just giving somebody else a compliment, not necessarily a girl that you like. And so I remember I was sat in the train to London. It's about a 45-minute train, and this couple sat right next to me, or sat opposite me. It was one of those. It was a part of the train where there's 4 seats, and I was on the 2 seats here, and then they sat on the 2 opposite seats. And the guy in front of me had a cool jacket, and a part of me thought, you know what? Let me just compliment this guy on his jacket, and maybe we could start a conversation, and that way I'd be a little bit more, socially warmed up, which should then make it easier for me to approach in London. And I remember the moment that I thought about, saying hi and giving the guy the compliment on the jacket, I started to feel that anxiety in my stomach, and my stomach really, it almost turned upside down, and I thought, why am I so nervous trying to give this guy a compliment? It's not that big of a deal. And then, I was sort of in my head, and I thought, this is ridiculous. I need to not give a fuck and just give the compliment. And so I got, in that very moment, that was the first time I properly overcame that social anxiety fear. And I gave the compliment even though I felt the anxiety in my stomach, because I guess in that moment I was thinking, what if he doesn't want to talk to me? What if they don't like me? What if other people in the train carriage look at me? What if other people hear our conversation? And then, what if it gets awkward? And all these racing negative thoughts obviously flood your brain. They were flooding my brain. And I just decided to overcome all of it, to just ignore it and just say what I had to say, and I said it. And then funnily enough, obviously, I guess unsurprisingly, he took the compliment well, and then he told me where he bought the jacket from. And then, myself, him, and his girlfriend, we had a whole conversation for the entire train journey before I got to London. And I won't bore you with the contents of the conversation. It wasn't anything special, but the point is, when I got off the train, I felt amazing, right? I was socially elevated. My mood was up. And the reason being is because I had just done something that seemed really difficult in the moment, but afterwards I felt amazing. And so I could already feel myself in this sort of frequency, this high frequency state where I wasn't so much in my head. I felt more liberated. I felt more carefree. I don't know, for some reason I felt like I was floating. And so I get to London, having just had this 45-minute conversation in the train. And then I get to central London, a place called Covent Garden. Some of you might know it. And I tell myself, okay, I'm gonna approach at least one person today, just one person. And after walking about for maybe 10-15 minutes, I get to a part of the area, and I see somebody I like, and I go, okay, just go say hi, give the compliment, and then leave. And so I did that, and I was very nervous doing it. I don't actually know how I sounded when I went up to her and gave the compliment, but it actually went well, So I gave the compliment. She said thank you. We then just talked about, what she was doing, where she was from. It turned out she was a student in London, but she was going back to her home country for the holidays. And we had a conversation, and then I somehow, some way, I was confident enough to ask her for her number, which I did, and she gave it to me. And then we just parted ways, and I remember feeling on top of the world. I felt incredible. It was an amazing feeling. And after that, I did maybe 2 more approaches in the span of an hour, which isn't that many compared to how many I can do now. But the point is, I did it, right? And I felt amazing afterwards. And I remember, that day, I remember at the end of that day, I came back home in the train, and I just felt incredible. It was an amazing feeling. So that was my first day of proper approaching, and this was all by myself. I hadn't been coached. At that point, all I'd watched was content on YouTube, and I was obviously a beginner, and I was trying to learn all of this by watching other people online do it. So I had no idea about technique. I had no idea about conversational skills. I didn't know what it meant to open, what it meant to close. I didn't know any of the technicalities behind the whole process. But I just went in for it. And yeah, I look back at that day as a very, very pivotal day, because everything that has happened since in the past year, it all started on that day when I decided to overcome my fear. And yeah, it's been a hell of a journey. And so, I guess I'll just talk more about what happened after that. So yeah, I had that amazing day, and like I said, I felt great. And so I immediately had this desire and appetite to go out again the next weekend. So I told myself, look, next weekend is looking sunny, let me go out again and get some more numbers and do some more approaches. And I did that. And then I very quickly realized that, of all the approaches that I did that went well, even though I got the numbers, they were all flaking on me. So every single number was flaking on me. And so it got to about maybe at that point I'd done 3 weeks of approaching on each weekend, and only one person responded, and that was the first person I approached, the girl I talked about, who was a student in London. So only one girl actually responded to my message, and at that point I must have approached at least maybe 5 or 6 in those 3 weeks, and heard nothing. Crickets from everybody else. And so of course at this point I thought, oh no, what's going on? I thought it was easy, right? I thought I would get the number, and then people would just respond to me. I'll get responses and set up dates, right? I was completely naive. I didn't know, that even though you can get a number, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a date. So yeah, that was a slap in the face. I remember there were times when I went out for a session, let's say on a Saturday, got 2 numbers, and then Sunday I would travel to London to do some improv classes. So this was at the time last year when I signed up for improv classes just for fun, and I always had an improv class on a Sunday, and so that was in London too, but I would drive. And I remember this is so funny, I remember I would be driving in my car to the improv class, constantly looking at my phone to see if the girl that I'd got the number from the day before had actually responded to my opening text. And this happened literally for 3-4 weeks in a row, where every time I checked my phone, no response. Anybody who has an iPhone, that ding sound when you get the message? I would wait for that ding sound and nothing came. And it was really annoying, and it was really frustrating, because of course at that point it becomes a common issue, right? It's one thing if it happened once or twice, but for it to happen again and again and again, I started to doubt myself and think, oh, this is actually way harder than I thought it would be. But nobody told me that was to be expected, right? Nobody told me that flaking is a normal part of the process, because at this point the only content I'd watched was a guy called Ruben on Social Animal. I'm sure some of you guys might have watched his content, but his content wasn't really cold approach. He wouldn't label it as cold approach. He was just trying to get people to get out of their comfort zones and talk to strangers or talk to beautiful women, whichever they preferred. But because his content, it didn't get into the technicalities, so he didn't talk about flaking and ghosting and how to actually ask for numbers or how to set up dates. His was very much just face your fear. It didn't get any deeper than that, which is fine. And I'm very appreciative of his content, because that's what got me out of my house to try it. But of course that content didn't give me the full picture on what to expect when you actually start to cold approach, because there are so many different layers to cold approach. So anyway, that was the first, let's say, 2 months, from September, October, and even November. So even 3 months really, where I didn't get any dates, right? I was getting a bunch of flakes, and I was only really approaching on the weekends because I live in a small town. So I didn't want to approach in my local area because, one, I didn't want to get a bad reputation, and there wasn't that much volume anyway. So it was limited in terms of how many approaches I could do, etc. And so yeah, that was the first, let's say, 2 to 3 months of my journey. And then, of course, I live in the UK, so the weather got worse. We entered winter time, so it got darker earlier. It was more rainy, so more, people weren't outside as much, and so it became difficult to even go to London and do approaches. So, the volume of my approaches went down significantly. And so this was when now I decided to start practicing elsewhere. And so it got to around mid-November, and I'd done some sessions in some malls, like some shopping malls, because it was cold. So it was going to be easier to do it inside. And yeah, I did some approaches in some malls, and again, of course, my technique was probably really bad, or maybe it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. But I wasn't getting much traction there either. And I would get some numbers, but then they would flake, or I would get some numbers and then they would respond, but then they would eventually ghost me after 1 or 2 messages. And so I kept hitting this plateau. I wasn't making any progress, and it was very frustrating. And so when it came to December, I actually decided to take a break. And so I said, you know what, I'm gonna stop approaching. This isn't working for me. I must have got to about 50 approaches at this point, or 40 odd approaches, which isn't that much if you think about it. 40 approaches within 3 months or 4 months. Yeah, 40 approaches within 3 months isn't that many approaches. I mean, for context, I've probably done 40 approaches in the last 2 weeks, right? And that's, me just going out for sessions and doing it in one weekend. So that amount of volume isn't that much. But of course, as somebody who was at the time learning it solo and didn't have anybody else to, critique and give me feedback, that was a decent amount as a beginner, right? But the point is, I got to that point and I hadn't seen any success. So remember this, 40 approaches, only at that point, literally only one number had properly responded to me, right? And then, that was that number, like I said, that was the first approach I ever did. And she wasn't even in the country because she'd gone back home, and wasn't coming back until the, next year. So in reality, I wasn't making any real progress, right? Although on reflection, I was making progress, because every single rep is progress towards getting better at the skill and being more confident, developing more mental resilience, etc. But either way, I get to December, I take that break, and then I come across a channel by a guy called Kristian Casanova. And this was the first time I came across content that was specifically geared towards daytime code approach in the UK, because he's British. And also it had a deeper angle to it. It had a technical angle to it. So Kristian broke down approach in a technical way, in terms of what to say, how to open, how to have good conversations, how to close, how to set up dates, body language, etc. Those sort of areas that you can tweak and work on to improve the quality of your technique. So that was one angle, which of course was missing from the original content I watched from Social Animal. And then there was the other angle, which was this sort of esoteric, almost spiritual, philosophical angle, where he didn't just see code approach as a way to get dates and get laid. It was actually a self-development tool, right? And so, and it's funny because in the 3 months that I'd been approaching up until that point, I always knew deep down inside that there was something deeper to this than just trying to get dates. And it's one of the reasons why I stuck with it, because I immediately felt more confident every time I went out for sessions and did approaches. And when I say I felt more confident, I mean I felt more confident in other areas of my life. So I felt more confident at work. I felt more confident in other social gatherings. I felt more confident when I was with my friends or with my family, and I even felt more confident to talk to strangers, right? To make up conversation with the shopping attendant or the barista, or even the guy at the store. Any sort of minor interaction, it felt way easier to have these conversations, simply because I went up for the approaches, right? So remember how I said earlier, so at this point I hadn't had any proper success in terms of dates, right? But the reason I kept going up until December was because I still felt something was changing. Yeah, I felt easy. I felt more confident in my social skills, in my conversational abilities, and that was. But I didn't know how to articulate it. I didn't know what was going on until I came across Christian's content, and that was when he, basically perfectly described it. And so that content is what gave me more motivation to get back into approaching, and really taking it more seriously and giving myself more time to get better at the skill. And so that's what I did. So around mid-December, I started going out again. And so even though it was cold, there was still weekends where the sun was out. So I would just go, put my jacket on, get on the train, go to London and, do a session for maybe 2 hours, and just to practice the skill set. And I would at this point, I'd learned about the importance of detaching from outcome and not worrying too much or not thinking too many steps ahead, which is what I was doing before. And I just focused on, let's say, the fundamentals. And so I tried that for a week or two. Again, didn't even really see much of an improvement in terms of getting numbers. I think for those first 2 weeks that I resumed my approaching at the end of December, I don't think I got any numbers, right? So you could argue that I regressed, right? Because at least before I was getting numbers, right? But this time I wasn't even getting numbers. But I kept going. And then yeah, the new year came, and I kept that momentum, and eventually I started getting numbers. And then I also implemented a sort of new strategy where instead of asking for numbers, I gave the girls my Instagram, and that seemed to work, right? So the reason I did that was because I'd learned about the idea of social proof and how it can be an advantage, or it can give you an advantage when it comes to selling yourself in these interactions. If you have an Instagram where you can essentially show the girl that you have a life, you have friends, you do things with, maybe you travel, maybe you have hobbies, I don't know, maybe you like to hike with your mates, essentially just showing that you're not just some random guy on the street, and that you actually have a life. And so I took that advice from Christian, and I decided to put a bit more effort into my Instagram at that point, and it worked. And so finally in February, I want to say February this year, I approached somebody in London. In fact, that day I approached 2 attractive girls in London, and I got both of their Instagrams, and I set up dates with both of them for the next week, and I went on both of those dates. And so that was a massive moment, right? Because at that point I would have been 5 months into approach, and 4.5, 5 months into approach, and I'd finally managed to land a date. And in fact I managed to land two dates in a week, and both dates went ahead, so they didn't flake, which was really, really positive. I won't go into the details of the dates, maybe on another video, But essentially, the first date didn't go that well. I was super nervous because you can imagine it's my first time actually, setting one up. And so I was very nervous. Um, in fact, before that date, I guess my last date would have been a year. Yeah, a year before that, somebody I met on Hinge. So this was, you know, a year before that, I was on the dating apps like many of you guys, and I was not finding any success. But for some odd reason, the algorithm gave me a layup back in a year before, and I matched with some girl, and yeah, we managed to go on a date. But I mean, it didn't go anywhere. But yeah, that was a dating app date, and I hadn't been on one since then. So, but this was a completely different situation, right? Because this was now a date from cold approach. So yeah, I think the nervousness and the novelty of it all probably shot me in the foot, which is understandable because I was still a beginner. It was still early days. And so yeah, I went on that date, didn't go well. And then I had the second date with the other girl probably a couple of days later on the weekend. And yeah, that date went really well. It's funny, yeah, that date went really well, but I didn't know what to do, and so I was very bad at reading signals. So looking back, I can tell that she was really into me, but I was so shy and I didn't know how to read the interest from her end. And so I didn't really make a move, yeah. And yeah, that date didn't go anywhere after that. So we had a great time together, we had fun, we ate food, went to the arcade, did whatever, but there was no like intimacy. And afterwards we were talking on text the days after, but eventually she said that she wasn't really ready for anything, and then it just ended there. And the same thing happened with the first girl. In fact, the first girl, we had that first date, and then we texted for a bit after that, and then eventually she just ghosted me and didn't reply to my messages. So you can imagine how I felt, right? So you can imagine I get this emotional high when I get the Instagrams and I set the dates up, and then I go on the dates, and then I have that low when I realize that the first date went poorly, and then the second date goes well, but then after that it doesn't go anywhere else. So that phase of having those dates was the first time I'd experienced that emotional roller coaster of cold approach. Yeah, because this was the first time I had actually found some good success, but then it was eventually followed by a dip. And so yeah, I think so yeah, that was still a good phase to go through, because it showed me that okay, this can work as a way of getting dates. And so my mentality at that point was, okay, let me just keep on approaching. Let me try and refine my technique to the best of my ability, given that I'm doing it alone. And let's see what happens. And at that time it was February, we're going into March, April, springtime, the weather's improving, the days are getting longer. And so I was more optimistic about how this would all play out. And to be fair, the next, let's say, 2 months were really, really good. I felt more confident in my approaches. I was doing more sessions. At this point, I crossed over the 100 approach mark, which is it's a number that Kristian is sort of defined as a minimum number of approaches that you have to do in order to be relatively proficient in the skill set. And so it was around February, March where I crossed over to that 100 mark. And that was a really big moment because it confirmed to myself that I was actually taking this really seriously. And so yeah, I crossed that pivotal moment, and then I kept on pushing, and I continued going out and approaching, and I landed more numbers, I got more dates. I remember one particular week where I went out for maybe 2 sessions, and I managed to set up 3 dates for the next week. So 3 dates for 1 week, which was insane to me, right? You have to remember, before I started Cold Approach, I could barely get a date every year, let alone 3 in 1 week. And all of those days ended up happening. Yeah, it was going well. But then I realized that I wasn't, so then the next issue, I guess, at this point was, being able to, flirt on the dates, or, be intimate with the girls on the dates, whether it was just, kissing them in the venue, or even like, maybe even going back to their place or going back to my place. And that was quite difficult, and that didn't really work. That wasn't working at that time. I was having the dates, but it wasn't. It felt more platonic rather than romantic. And so, yeah, that was the next sticking point that I had to overcome. And then I was trying to work on that, so I watched more content on that specifically. And yeah, eventually, so after that week where I had 3 dates, I approached another girl the week after, and it went well. We set up a date, and yeah, we went out for the date, and we had a really good connection, good chemistry. It was flirty fireworks pretty much from the beginning. And then I took a risk, and I essentially made a move on her, and it worked. Yeah, and we shared an intimate moment in the bar together. I didn't take her back to her place or anything. I didn't want to rush that, and I just didn't feel like it was the right thing to do it in that particular moment. But yeah, that was the first time I managed to actually share an intimate moment with my date, which was cool again, because I never thought that I could do that through cold approach. Because you have to remember that, when I approached that girl the week before, I saw her in the street, and I could have said no, but I decided to go and do it anyway, even though I was, still somewhat nervous and still had some doubts in my mind. And so to then eventually do the approach, have that conversation with her, and then go out on the date, and then actually make something of it. You can imagine, I remember being on the train back home after the date and thinking, wow, this actually happened. This skill set can actually yield, good results. Yeah, it was cool because I could finally see the progression, right? But as most people who do cold approach know, that was an emotional high, and I was feeling great. I was feeling on top of the world. And then before you know it, my ego comes crashing down. The universe humbled me. And after that point, I'd gone on quite a long streak of approaches, but no numbers. And then I would get numbers, but no dates. And so it kind of felt as if I was regressing. And then, so that happened for about, let's say, 3 weeks. And then I got to around, I want to say, maybe April, May. It got to around April, May. I hadn't been on too many dates. And I approached somebody in my local town. So this was the first time I'd, managed to set a date up with somebody who was in my local town. Because before this, I was quite afraid to approach in my local area because I was still building the skill set. And, based on advice from Kristian, he essentially said, you don't want to be approaching in your town until you're really confident in your skill as in terms of how good you are at approaching. And so even though I knew that I was decent, obviously, because I was managing to get dates at that point, I didn't feel like I was at that level where I was comfortable approaching in a place where lots of people know me, in a place where it's a very small, limited area in terms of people, footfall, even just the town center. It's not like London, where it's a massive metropolitan city with 10 million people. I live in a town where it's about 250,000 people. And it's a town, so there aren't that many people who are my age or relatively younger. It's a town full of families, so there aren't that many opportunities. And so it just isn't a prime location for something like cold approach. So the point I'm trying to make there is, when you're approaching your local town, it's you can't do mass approaching, you can't do sessions, because you're just going to be walking around the same area, and that is going to be a little bit weird. So you have to sort of pick your moments, yeah, which of course puts more pressure, because you want to make sure that every approach counts and that it's successful. And so, but of course I got more confident, and so at this stage of my journey, I felt confident enough to do a few approaches in town here and there, which is what I did, and it worked out. And so I did an approach, and the girl was immediately, like, she immediately loved it. She was turned on by it. She was so receptive. She's the kind of girl that would call like an on girl, somebody who's, she opens up as soon as you make yourself known, because there's that sort of, let's say, immediate connection. And yeah, it was fairly easy to set it up. And just 1 second. So I approached her, and there was a bit of an intermission there. The doorbell rang and had to get a parcel. Amazon, shout out to Amazon. Anyway, so yeah, so this girl was, she was into me from the beginning. I didn't even really have to do too much to get her number. And so so she was, at that point, she would have been the most receptive girl I'd ever approached, right? And she made it very easy to set up a date. And so we went on a few dates, and I could tell that this was somebody who I could easily settle down with and form a relationship with. And at this point, when I was thinking about that, I joined another community. So I came across another content creator called Ephraim, who runs Paul University, and Ephraim was coached by Kristian, and I was more heavily involved in Ephraim's community, in the Paul University community. And I asked him, I was in a bit of a, let's say, conundrum. I was on the fence, because on one hand, I liked this girl and she was cool, and we had some commonalities, some shared interests, and she was pretty attractive, decently attractive. But at the same time, I wasn't head over heels for her, and I also knew that there was so much more to gain from developing the skill set, and I didn't want to essentially settle for someone who, sure, it would give me someone, it would be an opportunity to end my dry streak and be in a relationship and have a steady stream of action. I didn't want to settle for that at the expense of building the skill set, because I could already see the fruits of the skill, right? Like I said before, between approach 0 and 100, I felt the confidence boost. But when it got to approach 100 to 200 and to 300, I really started to see a change in the way that I walked, the way that I talked, and my confidence in general, and just my ability to overcome fear. And so I didn't want to stop that progress just to settle for somebody who, she was cool, but she wasn't the best. And so I remember asking him for advice, Ephraim, for advice on that, and he broke it down and he said, look, if she's the one and she's perfect, then go for it. You've worked hard at this point, you've worked hard up until this point, so you might as well give it a go. But he said, on the other hand, if you don't actually want to settle down with this girl, and you're saying that you want to because it's an easier option and it will save you the pain of having to build the skill set even further, then I will take a long, hard look at yourself and say, okay, what do you actually want? Do you want to get better, or do you just want to settle? And I decided I want to get better. So I made the difficult decision to cut off communication with her. And I should admit, so at this point, me and this girl, we hadn't slept together, but we'd gone on dates and we'd been intimate and kissed and all this sort of thing, but we hadn't really gone the full distance yet. And so it's worth bearing in mind that up until this point, so at this point I must have done maybe, I don't know, I don't know how many approaches, 400 approaches or 300 approaches. And at this point I still hadn't been laid yet. And so yeah, you can imagine that was a tough decision, because chances are with this girl, if I'd stayed in the relationship a bit longer, it was bound to happen, right? But I decided to forgo that opportunity. And yeah, I mean, it was a tough decision, but ultimately I think it was the right one. Anyway, so yeah, I did that, and then yeah, decided to just continue pushing forward with the skill set, and yeah, just sharpening the skill set as much as possible. And so, like I said, this is when I joined Ephraim's Pro University community, and yeah, that was great, because now I was finally part of a community where I could seek advice and get feedback on my experiences, and just essentially normalize the process of approaching, and yeah, get some tailored feedback, even though it was virtual. And so that was really helpful. And so yeah, I kept on pushing through, and of course at this point we're getting into May, June, July, which was an interesting period, because I was making progress in terms of the quality of my approaches, but the dates started to wind down, and eventually I wasn't getting any dates whatsoever. And I went 1 month without a date, and then 2 months, and then it was getting to 2.5 months, 3 months where I was getting no dates. So I essentially went on a streak of no dates for about 10 weeks or 9 weeks, and that was a really tough period. I've referred to it in the past as my rut. So in the community, I remember writing a post about it, asking guys for advice on how to get out of it, because you can imagine, I'd made so much progress at the start of the year, and so to then get to a point where I dipped and then plateaued at the bottom and wasn't getting any action, even though I was putting in the reps. It was tough, because I thought that I developed the skill to a better ability than before, and so naturally I expected to see better results. But as you'll come to find, with cold approach, it's not a linear journey, right? You have these moments where you can have a great day, and then the next day you can have a terrible day, or you can have a good month and then you can have a terrible month, or you could even have a good month and then you could have a terrible 2 months. Now, to be fair, there's so many other factors that play into it, because like I said, back then and even now, I still live in my small town. So if I lived in a big city, then I would have way more opportunities to approach way more often throughout the week, rather than just being limited to 1 session or 2 sessions a week on the weekend, right? So that obviously limits the amount of exposure you get. And then of course, at this point, I was still learning it all by myself with content. So I didn't have anybody to correct my technique. I didn't have anybody to give me feedback. So I might have been making mistakes that I couldn't see myself. And with code approach, even the most intricate, let's say the most intricate weaknesses in your approach, they can make a big difference. But if you don't know it, then you're not going to be able to correct it. And so I'm sure all of these factors were playing into the reason why I didn't really see much success in that 3-month period. But yeah, I kept on going, and then eventually Ephraim decided to make a private community where he would offer like one-on-one virtual coaching or feedback. And so yeah, I signed up, and yeah, we had some long 2-hour, even 3-hour conversations talking about my experience so far, talking about the journey, and essentially trying to iron out any issues with the approach. And yeah, I found a lot of benefit and a lot of value from it. It just gave me a game plan to execute on, and so I was able to really, focus on the core areas that would improve my approach. And before you know it, I think a week, maybe 2 weeks went by after joining the community, the private one, and I started to see an uptick in results. So I started getting more dates, and then eventually, actually, I got a date with a girl that I met in my local town as well, and that eventually led to getting laid. And that was the first time I'd been laid in quite a few years, about 3-4 years. And so that was the first time I actually went the full distance with cold approach. So this would have been, when was this? This would have been in July. So that would have been 10 months into my cold approach journey. So it took me 10 months to finally go the full distance, which, I mean, it seems like a long time. Maybe to the people watching that seems like a long time. But again, everybody's journey is different. So we're all starting from different places. And like I said, for the majority of that period, I was being coached solo. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to predict what's going to happen, like what kind of results you're going to get, unless you have somebody looking at your entire, just your entire self and all the different areas of your, let's say, social skills, confidence, career, self-worth, and yeah, just all these different intangibles that determine how quickly you'll be successful. But either way, I finally had that, let's say, happy ending. And so then after that, I still felt as if I could do better in terms of my technique. So I decided to reach out to Ephraim to get coaching, like proper in-person coaching. So yeah, we flew out to Belgrade, Serbia, and yeah, did a 5-day immersion where we just focus on the techniques, focus on how to improve my conversations. And I won't talk in too much detail about that experience, but ultimately it was a really important experience, because even though I'd done about 600 approaches up until that point solo, I probably did about maybe 80 or 90 approaches in Serbia, but those 90 approaches were really important because that was the first time I had proper feedback from somebody who was really good at the skill set. And so the learning curve was just way steeper. I learned so much in that 5-day period compared to, let's say, the past 150 days. And so, yeah, I came out of that immersion truly transformed, and I was way more confident in my technique. And also, I've talked about it before, but the experience in Belgrade was important because it was a normalizing experience. So what it did for me was it normalized cold approach as a skill set and as something that's a genuine way to get dates and attract women. And the reason it was normalized is because I saw Ephraim do it, I saw other guys in the community do it, like Joseph, and we just had these really in-depth conversations about why it's an incredible skill set, how it benefits you outside of dating, how to get good at it, what the fundamentals are, how to have fun with it, and yeah, just all these really interesting aspects of cold approach that not many people talk about. And so, yeah, to just be in a different country, new culture, and be with Ephraim, and we had a good time as well, but we also, really got down into the trenches with the coaching and the sessions, and even in Belgrade there was lots of ups and downs, but yeah, ultimately I came away from it with a lot more knowledge, and a lot more experience. And so I came back to London and I hit the ground running again. So this would have been now August August, so maybe a month ago now. And yeah, so I came back to London, hit the ground running, went out for sessions. Yeah, again, you know, I think I got maybe, yeah, I mean, to be fair, actually, so Belgrade was a month and a half ago, and I'd been, so I'd done a few sessions, and to be fair, I didn't really get any dates, but of course at this point I knew that that's part of the process. You're not always going to get dates just because you go out to a session or just because you've been coached. I understand that it's a lottery system, so it's not always going to go as planned, but yeah, but I could certainly feel a massive difference in my confidence and my conviction in the approaching. And then actually, funnily enough, I think the first date that I've been on since the immersion was yesterday, and so that was somebody that I approached on the same day. So I went out for a session yesterday with Ephraim, who's actually in London right now, and yeah, did an approach. She loved it. We set up a date for that evening, so for yesterday evening, and then we went for a date. It didn't go anywhere in terms of happy ending, getting laid or whatever, but I had a fun night. And I guess that's just been the journey so far. So yes, now we're in September, so it's now been a year since I first started. I've done 700 and 90 approaches around there. I'm keeping count until I get to 1,000, and then once I get to 1,000, I'll stop counting, because I think 1,000 will be a really huge milestone for me. But yeah, it's been a hell of a journey. I'll probably do a part 2, talking about more lessons I've learned, and where I want to go with the rest of where I want to be at the end of the year, and then also just talking about specific areas of code approach and hopefully stuff that resonates with you. But yeah, that's been the year of code approach, and I'll catch you in the next one.